He's in the Army ACUs, which is the ugly, light green, sandy type, just the gross ones. It's the Army's first attempt at digital camouflage.
Yeah.
And he's laying, and this picture's all over the interwebs, but he's laying on this like green floral pattern couch from like the 1960s. And if you didn't know that there was somebody sitting there, like, or if he didn't have boots on,
You wouldn't see him.
Blends in perfectly with a floral pattern couch, and that's what we were wearing in the desert in Afghanistan. So that's cool.
Dude, she's down. Let's go.
Dude, I just shot a deer of a lifetime.
Freaking smoked him.
One with nature, and if you're a believer, one with God.
Definitely gets your heart pumping. Boy, you are in trouble.
Fall Obsession Podcast.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another Fall Obsession Podcast episode. I'm Sam. I'm your podcast host this week. Fall Obsession is driven by Ridge Rock Hunt Company. They are the podcast partner. We appreciate Derek and Lacey over there. I'll talk more about them at the end of our episode. I am back in person, recording with Mr. Mike Behrens. He's back on the podcast with me. A couple weeks ago, you guys probably heard a very controversial episode that we recorded. I don't know where you stand on it, but it's a good one. The family-friendly topic, or the headline, I guess you could say, is hunting is conservation. But we dive into a whole lot more when it comes to some of the political scenery behind that. Not something we normally touch at Fall Obsession on our podcast, but yeah, we went there. So go check that episode out if that's the case. We're recording the same evening, which is why we're in the same clothes if you're watching the video. But we wanted to get back on the hunting train tracks, if you will, and talk about something. I'll kind of tell what inspired the talk, but I want to talk about the theory behind camouflage, I guess you could say, is a good headline for this episode. But we went hog hunting the other night out there on the Texas dirt place, and despite our best efforts, unsuccessful. But we're sitting there, it's getting dark into the evening, and then it gets dark, and we sit for a good while after it gets dark, with the slow glow out there, waiting on or hoping that we would draw on a pig. That's another story, but
We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. Needless to say, what inspired me for this topic was I'm sitting there on the ground next to Mike. I have on two different camo patterns. Mike has on two different camo patterns, and neither of them match my two different camo patterns. And then after it gets completely dark, I switch and I go blackout. Like I put on a black, fleece top and kind of change my approach a little bit there. And I never once was concerned with our visibility, you could say, or how out there we were. And that kind of inspired me to talk about this because, especially for people who are new to hunting, the novice hunter out there, when you're going out and you're going to Walmart or Academy or wherever you're going to get your first set of hunting clothes at least speaking from my own experience, when I started, I always gravitated toward the leafy patterns, or the patterns that were an actual object, that were actual trees, actual leaves, actual grass, and that kind of thing. And not to say that those patterns don't have their time and place, but what a lot of people don't realize is camo, it broken down, is much more about shades, shapes, tones, and that kind of thing, especially when it comes to whitetail, because they're colorblind. So that's what I wanted to dive into and talk about that, because we're seeing not only a shift in some people's opinions on that, but then a shift in the industry when it comes to these camo manufacturers. and what they're rolling out in regards to patterns. And you having your military background, you have a lot of experience with the multicams, and you wanted to bring it up, and we were chuckling earlier about the...
Oh, I found it.
Yeah, you found it. We'll have to put it in the podcast video so y'all can see. But the early days military multicams, oh my gosh. This dude, for those who are just listening on Spotify or whatever app you're on, this dude is...
He's in the Army ACUs, which is the ugly light green sandy type, just the gross ones. It's the Army's first attempt at digital camouflage.
Yeah.
And he's laying, and this picture's all over the interwebs, but he's laying on this like green floral pattern couch from like the 1960s. And if you didn't know that there was somebody sitting there, like, or if he didn't have boots on,
you wouldn't see him.
Blends in perfectly with a floral pattern couch, and that's what we were wearing in the desert in Afghanistan. So that's cool.
That tells me that we need to find that couch and put it in a deer blind.
Yeah, I would love to have that set up right there. So that was obviously not a good match for any environment whatsoever, except for
that couch.
Yeah, if you're a sniper in a living room and you need to blend in with your surroundings, that was the only use for that.
That was the way to go right there.
So thankfully, yeah, the Army moved on to bigger and better things. But yeah, all around the military, what they've been doing is they've been gravitating towards, your kind of woodland-esque camo patterns. Now the multicams is what most people would associate that with, but it used to be the old BDU pattern, the woodland camo.
Right.
Marines have stuck really, really hard with the digicams, and me personally, I like the pixelated variant of it. If you notice the stuff that I was wearing, it looked almost pixelated.
Yeah, I mean, you have some over there on that chair too.
Yeah. It's a little bit pixelated, but it's not straight lines. There are no straight lines in nature.
Right.
So that's the big thing, is like perfect squares, not great. But also, like, you go to woodland camo, I have never seen anything in nature look like woodland camo.
Yeah, true.
Like the old school BDU pattern.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything in nature that looks like that. So, I mean, those are obviously, that's a really early version, because, I mean, our version of camouflage back in, like Vietnam was olive drab green.
Yeah.
Just a block of it.
Right.
And we were supposed to blend in with that in a jungle. Didn't happen. But that's where the Special Forces guys started using the tiger stripe.
Yeah.
And the tiger stripe worked really well because of the way the jungles lay. You have these big swooping plants and big tall grasses, and those stripes fit in perfectly.
Stripes and the shades that those create, yeah.
Like said tigers.
Yeah.
Weird.
Funny how that works. Almost like it was meant to be.
Right. So, and that's the whole thing with camo. I mean, the basic theory of camo, according to Wikipedia, is the use of any combination of materials, coloration, or illumination for concealment, either by making animals or objects hard to see or by disguising them as something else. So that's talking more along the lines of like a leopard coat or a tiger coat or something like that.
Right.
But we use the same concept. We are the animal we want to conceal.
Right.
So same thing applies. Tiger stripe, highly effective, especially, when you're talking like tall grasses and things like that. But it also depends on what you're doing. I mean, if you're sitting in a ground blind, wear black.
Yeah. And I think that's a fairly well-known and well-educated point in the hunting world is, they design the inside of these ground blinds to be blacked out. Mm. And so just because you're hunting doesn't mean that you wear camo.
Right.
In that instance, your environment is blacked out. So what are you going to do? You're going to match that blacked out environment. Mm-hmm. Me, the other night when we were hog hunting, I'm sitting there, it gets dark, and I have no doubt that if I had stayed in my camo, I probably would have been just fine. You stayed in your camo, and you were fine. But I went all in, I swapped into the blackout cover because where we're sitting tucked back in the trees, and when we walked out to the slow glow, to pack it up, you look back into that hole and it's just a black hole.
You couldn't see anything in
You
that
couldn't.
cove.
Exactly. So that is the environment that we're matching in that instance, you know. So, and you talk about the history of, you know, kind of where the military started and their changing and, you know, the effects over the years of where they went with their camouflage patterns. In the hunting world, you have, you know, the two big names, obviously everybody knows, is Realtree and Mossy Oak, you know, the ones that have been around forever that dang near invented hunting camouflage, you know, just about.
Used to be jeans and a t-shirt.
Yeah, or flannel, which we can talk about that too. But the like with them, you look at their very early and first on generations of patterns, and like Realtree had a tree bark pattern.
Right.
Like it just looked like bark on a hardwood tree. That's it. And it worked. It worked for guys who were like running, gunning, doing the turkey hunting and doing all that kind of stuff. It worked great. But, you know, the hunting industry as a whole transitioned into those more leafy patterns, the actual objects and stuff, which also serve their purpose when used in the right environment. And I know that that's what camo comes down to, is using it in the right environment. There's truly, at least in my opinion, there's truly no pattern that works in every environment out there. But now you're seeing all these manufacturers, especially the new ones that are popping up, they don't even have a pattern with leaves or stuff in them. You're seeing all these manufacturers, including the big names, going back to those bark-like patterns, shades, shapes, the multicam mentality behind it. And that's where everybody's driving towards, because they're understanding more that it's not about the object, it's about breaking you up. You are the object,
right?
And you don't need to be the object. That's what it comes down to, which I love that school of thought. I think it's great. But
yeah, and it comes down to wherever you're going to be at. I mean, like we said, if you're in a ground blind, we're black.
Yeah.
I mean, I shot that deer in the backyard, and I was wearing a dark gray Old Navy hoodie.
Yeah.
And a black stocking cap.
Yeah.
And that was
160-inch deer.
That was it.
Yeah.
So he did not know I was there. But again, on the rifle that was sticking out the window, that was not black. That had, you know, the ghillie strings and everything hanging off it, so it looked similar to that ground blind.
Right.
It looked similar to the viney trees that were out back out there, because it just had, you know, the stringy vine looking crap hanging off of it. So, you know, and it's all about what are they going to see. So that's an example of multiple uses of camouflage. So I've got the overarching camouflage on the ground blind, which has its own pattern. And then I have my camouflage for the inside, which is all blacked out, down to the gloves on my hand, which I wore the same gloves bow hunting.
Right.
They were just the black, real thin leather pat-down gloves from the police world. But they're great.
They work, yeah.
And then the third level of camouflage was for the rifle that was actually visible outside of the blind. And that had stuff to match the surroundings.
Yeah.
So sometimes you're not going to have just one set of camo on. You're going to have multiple types of camo, or you're going to have the ability to transition into it. And depending on like what we were doing out there, we started in daylight because the time frame, now granted, we found out the hard way that there was no pigs on that entire ranch. So the best bait and best plan in the world wasn't going to matter. But
that's a jab at me, folks, in case y'all can't tell.
So, but yeah, I mean, we had the ability to transition to different things. So when you're sitting out there in broad daylight, yeah, you want to be broken up because that's when they can see the best, which, I mean, certain animals have better sight than others. Deer, wow, they have some pretty good eyesight on them.
Yeah.
And I got an example of that too, but I mean, for where we were, pigs don't have the greatest eyesight, but they got great smell, great hearing, and they can see okay during the day. So for us sitting where we were sitting, we were fully illuminated too. And with that said, we're going to need to be broken up. So that's why there were, varying types of camo. If you notice, like I was wearing that black long sleeve, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I had the black long sleeve, and then I had just the regular camo pants, and they had that broken up, blotchy, kind of digitized pattern on them. Now, as the sun started going down, the shadow gets cast, And now my black t-shirt starts working with the shadows.
Right.
And I didn't know why you put the hoodie on. I thought you were cold.
It was both.
Okay.
I
was
brought
trying
it.
to tough it out.
I brought it thinking, well, one, it might get cold, but then I'm going to bring this one because when it gets cold, it's going to be dark. So there were two schools of thought.
Yeah, I didn't really expect it to get cold, so I'm like, man, I can't like start whining about it being cold out here. And then I saw you put on a hoodie or a fleece or something. I'm like, oh.
I should have brought mine.
So, but as it turned out, and I didn't realize, what it was going to look like from the outside looking in. But when I went up there and I adjusted the light, then I turned around and looked back, and it hadn't even gone all the way down. I mean, we weren't in.
It was right at dusk, yeah.
And I looked back, and I couldn't even see you sitting in that bright gray lawn chair. Because the lawn chair was by and large covered up. But, I mean, for an animal that can't really see that well in the color spectrum, it wouldn't have mattered anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
So everything back there was pretty broken up. Like I couldn't really, even with our ability to see different shades and colors, I mean, I had a hard time seeing what was actually back there.
Yeah.
So, and that was before it even got dark. And that was actually what really concerned me is like if they can't see us and we're sitting there with no backdrop on us, I mean, it wasn't really out of the question if they didn't smell us. They'd walk right up on us.
Yeah. Yeah, I normally try to, obviously the ground blind hunting, we already talked about that, wear black. But one thing that I've learned is hunting from the ground like we were. Normally I'm comfortable with, I would just classify them as darker camo patterns. Camo patterns that aren't quite as open, that have a little more shade to them. But when I'm in a tree stand, for example, that's when I normally try to wear a much more lighter and more open pattern, whatever it might be. Even in the early season, I've even worn a more grassy camo pattern just because that one in particular, the browns match the tone of the tree I'm in, and it has more green and there's more foliage on the leaves and everything. So even though the pattern itself is designed for a more Western style, I've also worn it on the plains in Montana, but it works in the tree as well. And that's because I try to think of it as a deer looking up into a tree. I don't want to be dark and just look like a blob that doesn't belong when they look up there. I want to be broken up and I want to be lighter so that it looks more like they're looking through leaves. There's because you got to think from their perspective, they're looking at foliage and sky on the other side.
That's the key component that everybody always misses is the sky. If you're shooting down at an animal on the ground and you're up in the air, well, especially later in the fall when the leaves have all fall off, now you've got open sky. So whether it's bright blue or whether it's gray, it doesn't matter. You got to have some kind of a gap in that camouflage. And if you don't, you are going to look like a blob up there.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what I'm seeing most often when these camo promos and stuff like that. They're, you got this dude sitting up there in the tree and he's hanging off this tree and he's all ready to go with his bow, but he looks like a cancerous growth on the side of this tree up against this blue sky. And I'm like, so what good does that? Because if I look up, I'm like, I would have the same reaction that deer in the backyard had when he saw me from 60 yards away sitting in between two trees.
Yeah.
There's no reason. I mean, a human would have walked right by me and not even really known I was there unless I knew what to look for. But this deer from 60, 70 yards away looks right at me and he's like, there's something wrong there.
Yeah, he's seen it before. He knows what it looks like, and he knows it's different.
So it didn't matter how good of a camo setup I had. He knew that there was something else there, and it spooked him.
Right.
So same thing. If they're looking at the same trees every single day when they come in to feed, they look up and they're like, uh-huh. And then they turn around and leave.
Yeah. One thing that I've, to that point that I remember, it's just always stuck with me, growing up, my dad and I would always watch the Monster Buck VHS tapes, like the really old Realtree videos and everything. That was like our get pumped for hunting season ritual that we would always do. But there was one guy on there that it was like December, so all the leaves are gone, just sticks up in the air coming from the trees. And he's hunting somewhere Midwest, South. There's no snow on the ground, and he's walking out there in a snow camo suit. And he's like, think about it. I'm up in a tree, 25
Right.
feet up, deer are looking up. He goes, this is going to break me up and blend me in with the skyline instead of me being in a hardwoods pattern to where I'm just a brown blob up there. And that kind of put it in perspective for me at that time. I was like, I never thought of that, trying to not just match your environment or match shades, tones, and colors, but also what is the backdrop from the prey's perspective,
Right.
if that makes sense.
And it's the same thing, going back to the concept of, concealing yourself in. If you're going to box yourself in shooting from a ground blind or, from an elevated hunting blind, well, they're used to those things because those structures have been there for a while. So, I mean, all you need to do is be dark.
Right.
So if you're dark, they can't see your movement on the inside unless you're backlit, which
Right.
That's fun when that happens. But yeah, that's the same concept. It's a very basic concept that they teach in any form of military training too. I mean, it's the same thing. If you're shooting from inside a room, shoot from back into the room, which is obviously is not that big of a deal with deer because one shot and the hunt's over anyway. But, the concept is shoot from further back in the room. That way they don't know where the shot's coming from. So you're going to want to black yourself out. You're going to want to make sure that the window is covered with, vision screens and things like that. So, and that's where the concept of those shoot-through mesh windows on the ground blinds comes in.
Yeah, those are pretty incredible. As long as you don't shoot a broadhead that is
let's not do that.
Is compromised by hitting an object like that mesh. So
to me, that shoot through is more for rifle only. I don't think that I would be comfortable shooting an expandable broadhead.
Expandables are a no-go and stuff like that. If you shoot a fixed blade, that works. You can get away with it. But again, probably 20, 30 max even at that, because right out of the gate, you're interrupting your flight of the arrow. At least that's always been my school of thought behind
and again, you're going to want to do that. I mean, if you're going to use that system of camouflage, you're going to want to go through and you're going to want to train for it too.
Right.
It's just like me shooting with a ghillie suit on. Great idea. Terrible execution, because I should have known better than to do that if I would have trained properly with all that equipment on, whereas I was only using pieces of it just to understand how it functioned. But if I would have shot with the entire system on, I would have known that was not going to be something viable.
That's a pitfall a lot of archers seem to fall into, because you think about it at the beginning of bow season, it's still warm. You can be out there typically with just one layer on for the first few weeks of the season. And then even after that, then you get into you're wearing a lightweight sweatshirt or something like that. But then you start getting, if you're a late season bow hunter, like I am, for example, well, it kind of sucks in September when it's still 100 degrees in Texas to shoot with a sweatshirt or a jacket on. But you owe it to yourself and to that game to at least take a few shots with it,
right?
Just to make sure, even if it means that you sweat through it once before the season starts. You got to wash the machine, man. You can clean it.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, you gotta practice how you're gonna play. And that was one of the big things. I kind of had to think about how long am I actually going to bow hunt? Because I know I'm not going to be able to bow hunt on the deer lease after October, because everybody's going to be out there shooting high-powered rifles, and it's just not going to happen. So that's where I was like, okay, I'll press real hard out there, and then I'll come back and I'll see how the bow thing works in the backyard, and used the backyard more for bow, and then I transitioned over to rifle once the weather got a little bit colder. But that was the same thing. It's like I would change not only camouflage, but I would change weapon system based on the environment too. So if I was going to have to bundle up to the point of not having functionality of the bow, then it's time to switch over to the rifle and do it that way. Yeah. So the situation dictates everything from the weapon system down to what you're wearing. And that's an important concept for people, because what you're wearing for camo early on in the season is going to be very different pattern-wise and color-wise than you'd be wearing in the end of the season, especially in your temperate climates like you get further north, like up in Iowa and Minnesota.
That was the other thing I was going to bring up, is at least down here, I know, we typically are not going to be hunting in temperatures any colder than low 30s, high 20s.
It's really cold.
And don't get me wrong, that's plenty cold. But
feels like it anyway.
But my point being is we talk about camo patterns, but the clothing itself that these manufacturers are putting out now, you are finding so much more clothing that is thinner, lighter, less bulky, but equally, if not more, warm than it was before.
Right.
And that is huge, I think, for the late season bow hunter, being able to have those opportunities to use apparel that allows you to not have to worry about, a string slapping your forearm or something like that because you're in a heavy coat.
Well, and that's where, other little pieces of equipment, like you saw how I had the forearm guard. I put that on, and mostly that's just because I haven't really figured it out yet, how to not get a giant bruise on the inside of my forearm. And I try to manipulate how I hold my hand and all that good stuff. But, I mean, when you get into wearing multiple layers, unless you're cutting your forearm off on every piece of clothing that you have, and you cut the forearm off of that clothing, it's going to be just as thick there as it is on your chest.
Right.
So if you've got stuff, and I found this out the hard way too, if I would have been wearing my forearm shin, I would have taken that 10-pointer with a bow instead of a rifle. But I had this big bulky sleeve on, and I wasn't even thinking about it. And it hit that sleeve, hit the trajectory of the arrow up, and I missed him right over the top by it changed the arrow 6 inches.
Yeah.
So I hit him, not well, but I got that little nick slice on his back, and that was it.
Yeah.
But he came back and he let me finish it later, so it's all
Yeah,
good.
you got your
But
redemption.
If it's certain things like that, I mean, you might not need it to prevent a bruise, but you might need it to keep your clothing out of the way.
Yeah.
So
True.
those things like that have a function too. And instead of, I'm sure there's companies out there that have good patterning, and they have stuff specifically designed for archery that maybe is a little bit thinner in that area, but people on a budget aren't going to be able to afford that $280 hunting top with the specifically designed forearms on it.
Yeah.
So sometimes you got to buy the $20 piece from the big box store and strap it on there and call it a day.
Hey, if you're redneck enough, you'll spray paint a piece of cardboard and a couple zip ties, and you're good to go. So
That works too. I didn't even think about that one.
I've seen that done before.
Just
That's
get the
why I
camouflage
mentioned it.
duct tape.
Yeah, there you go. Just duct tape your forearm and you'll be good to go. But I don't know. I wanted to bring that up, and I wanted to talk about it just because, I know we reach people that are few and far between as far as their experience level and everything, and I don't want folks to feel like when you're going out you have to buy, the leafy patterns or the stuff that looks like the tree you're going to be sitting in and stuff like that. There, aside from listening to this podcast, there's so much more research that you as listeners, as the consumer, can do to find something that's in your price range that'll work for you. And there's different environments too. Like I know down here in Texas, with kind of this scrub brush stuff that a lot of us are in, there's a select few patterns that could pretty much work for almost anything, or you can make it work for almost anything. But then, like I mentioned earlier, you get up to Montana, well, yeah, if I'm in the sage and the, prairie grasses out there, that's definitely an environment where I'm going to be in a grassy pattern.
Right.
I'm going to specifically plan for that, because if I'm not, then I'm a dark blob out there crawling through the sage, so.
Yeah, and you go back to your different shades too. I mean, you can have kind of a similar camo pattern almost across the board, as long as you're manipulating. If they come in an elongated form, I don't know why any camo pattern is more of a horizontal elongation, because nothing in nature is going to lay like that.
True.
For the most part, it's always going to be a vertical or a canted. So you're coming down to looking at just a general detail of like a color. So if you're going to be hunting in like an arid western environment, you can still get that same pattern, but if you don't get it in such a drastic color change, whereas if you're hunting, the middle of timber, with a bow in October, it's going to be very different. And also with hog hunting too, if you've got daylight shots on pigs, and that can be in the middle of summer or the middle of winter.
Yeah.
You know your area. So if you're shooting and it's going to be lush green, so you're going to have your dark greens, your light greens, and your blacks for the shadows, that's the type of camo you want. Pattern can be the exact same as the stuff you wear in the winter, but you have to have that color, so that way it's going to exacerbate those differences in shade. Whereas if you're hunting an arid environment, ground hunting an arid environment like the plains, you can still have that same camo pattern to an extent,
Right.
but the color needs to be way more subtle,
Yeah.
and it has to be a lot lighter. So those are the things that you have to look at. It's not about buying, okay, I've got 17 different camouflage suits that I can wear for whatever.
Yeah.
Just get a couple of different shades and vary your use of those shades. And, especially with hunting in the plain, like bow hunting, like you're going to be stalking, and most of the time you're going to do some knee crawling. So do you really need to match your top with your bottom? Not really, because that's going to be covered up with the natural grass anyway.
Yeah.
So you only need to worry about the top. And that's why most of the time you see two different types of camo on people, is because they don't have to care about what the bottom looks like, because it's usually covered up with foliage.
Yeah. Very, very true. The other thing too that I was going to hit on with the pigs, at least for those folks listening that are up north and might not have ever hunted pigs before, just not because they don't want to, just lack of opportunity is simply what it comes down to. Neither here nor there. There are smart pigs, and pigs, I feel like, often get credited for just being dumb animals. They're not dumb animals, not by a long shot. But their senses, as we talked about earlier, are, I feel like, dulled a little bit when they're in groups. Mm-hmm. The wind is one thing. If the wind's not in your favor, then deer, pigs, yeah, you're not going to have much success. But if the wind's in your favor and pigs are in a large group, their sense of smell, to a point, certainly their eyesight, and then their hearing, which is what they rely on a lot, is suppressed by their own noise, because they are noisy animals.
Yep.
For sure. I say that because while I've had very smart pigs that have picked me out the second they walk out and turned around and left, I've also just straight up walked up behind a group of them just because they weren't paying attention. Last year, our staff manager and I went out there to where actually the exact same stand that we were hunting, and sat on the other end. It was a morning hunt. It was 92 degrees when the sun came up, so it's middle of summer, and we're both sitting there in khaki shorts and a camo t-shirt, and he shot a pig.
Yep.
So, but in a group at the same time. So, I don't want to make it sound like we're going all hot and heavy on the pig hunting, because the other side of that is you got plenty of guys who spend more time hog hunting than we do. They're like, man, I never wear camo. I do it in blue jeans.
Right.
I'm just out there driving around a truck or whatever. Or certainly just camo in general. You go back to old school guys, old school way of thinking, blue jeans and a flannel shirt. Flannel worked back then because it broke you up.
Yep.
And that was before camo was really fully evolved. My dad, he hunts in blue jeans and a sweatshirt. He sits in a blind, but he hunts in blue jeans and a sweatshirt. And if it's really cold, then he has this brown like coverall suit that he wears. I joke with him because I think he looks like a deer, but I haven't seen him wear all camo in years.
Yeah.
And he kills deer every year.
Yep.
And
camos, it's going to be, it's a very specific thing. I mean, for some, it's a psychological thing too. You dress for what you're going to do.
Right.
How many times do you see, these Pee-wee football teams, and they can't afford nice uniforms, and then somebody comes in and sponsors a uniform buy for them, and they come out and they're just like the most amazing Pee-wee football team ever, because now they feel good.
They have shirts
about what they're doing.
Exactly.
And that's the whole thing too. It's a psychological effect on us too. If we go out and it's like, look, I'm geared up, I got my stuff, I'm ready to go. Now you're going to be mentally more in tune to it too. That does have a psych effect on it. So, and then there's also, to go back to pigs being and deer and coyotes. The because I had all of them that night. It was the last pig I shot. It was back in December. And I had been out there for, I think it was like a day and a half, and hadn't seen a single thing moving. And I'm to the point where I'm just like, I don't even care anymore. I got one more night here, and I'm probably not going to see anything, whatever. So I was using one of the other guys' mules, because our side-by-side didn't have a transmission at that point. You could go forward, and that was it. So I decided not to use that one. So I'm using his white Kawasaki mule. I mean, this thing might as well have been a torch in the middle of this grass field.
Glowing out there.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, stark white, and it was full moon, too. So we had tons of illumination. So I literally looked like a candle out in the middle of this wheat field. And I'm 50 yards away from the feeder. And the first thing I see coming in, and I couldn't have been there 40 minutes. And I see this silhouette coming in. I'm like, okay, well, cool. So I turn the IR on, and I start glassing whatever was coming in. It was a buck. And it was not a small buck. And he looked right at me as he was walking. He's looking right at me because he heard the click of the flashlight. It didn't stop him. He just jumped right over that fence, right into the feed pen, and started eating. And it was dark, so obviously there's nothing I could do. Nor would I, because it's not my feeder, not my deer.
Right.
But yeah, I'm watching him, and I'm texting the guy, and I was like, hey man, you need to check your camera right now. And he texts me back. He's like, yeah, go figure. It's dark. I'm not there. Why wouldn't the 10 or 12 pointer show up?
Why wouldn't the big boy come out?
So we have that, and I'm sitting there watching this deer eat for, I mean, he was there forever. He just pitched a tent and camped.
Wow.
Had to be every bit of 45 minutes that this horse was out there eating. And then I start hearing some chatter behind me, and I'm like, all right, so what is this? Now, mind you, white Kawasaki mule, I'm sitting in the mule in the middle of this. Like, that's how little I cared at that point. And this deer's here, and then I got chatter behind me. So I'm turning around, and now you can hear everything I'm doing because there's no wind. And I look behind me, and I've got 6 sets of eyes behind me. Like, literally, they're just sitting on the trail, just staring at me. 6 coyotes.
Wow.
Things that I'm never going to see again.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at that. I'm like, all right, cool. Well, obviously, camouflage is not a real important thing at this point, because I was not camouflaged.
Yeah.
I was sitting high. I mean, I had my camo on. This is because it was warm.
It doesn't matter, yeah.
And I'm in this giant plastic, oversized golf cart, basically. And I'm resting the rifle on the plexiglass window in front of me, and just kind of chilling out and just glassing this stuff. And just, it's like there was nothing quiet about anything I was doing. So it wasn't quiet. I wasn't concealed at all. And I've got 6 coyotes behind me, and one of the bigger bucks on that entire property sitting right in front of me, just chilling. Like, he literally kept looking up at me. And then finally he jumps the fence and leaves. Coyotes all leave. And I'm like, all right, cool. So I waited a little bit, and I got tired. So I took a nap. And I woke up a couple hours later, and I see another silhouette coming in. So I look, and this was about a 250, 275 pound boar.
Wow.
So he's coming in. I'm like, all right, cool. Now I got to get serious. Now, again, they can't see real well, especially at night, but it's not like I was quiet.
Yeah.
So I get situated and everything, and let him do his thing for a couple minutes. I wasn't going to shoot him because I couldn't eat him. And then he gave like this nonverbal, and then I see like a dozen other pigs, smaller ones. And you ever seen a pig run?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They look like they're smiling, right?
Yep.
So they're all smiling, running towards the feeder and everything, and that's how that all happened. But I mean, camouflage played 0 part in any of that whatsoever, because they just didn't care. And that's the whole thing too, is the animals have a vote too.
Yeah.
The animals will determine whether you matter or not. And if you give them a reason to make you matter, then they'll leave.
It's so funny, just what occurs like in those moments where you feel like you're just, going half-hearted about it or not trying or whatever, because it's always something like that happens. The biggest buck I've ever killed in my life was 10 years ago. I was sitting on a ridge because we got to the property, the lease, late that day. It had just had like one of the classic Texas ice storms, And we're like, well, we're not doing anything else, so we might as well go hunting. It's just going to take us longer to get there. And it took us twice as long to get there, but we got there. And it was like 4:30 in the afternoon. I'm like, I'm not going down to a stand. I'm not going to bump stuff out of there. I'm just going to sit on this ridge and just watch deer tonight. That's all I'm going to do. And lo and behold, sitting there in a black coat and blue jeans in the snow, mind you, I shot the biggest deer of my life that night.
Because camo didn't matter at that point.
For whatever reason, that's just how the cards fell, you know?
And that's, I mean, we're probably not answering anybody's question.
We're probably not. We're just rambling over here.
But the whole thing is, I mean, camo has its place, but it is not going to make or break your hunt. And that's realistically, I mean, there are some instances where
unless it does.
Yeah, there's some instances where it will, but I mean, by and large, if you got a mossy oak versus your generic Cabela's. I mean, is that really going to matter? No, it's honestly it won't, unless it's like a mossy oak, like a leafy pattern or something like that, and you're up in a tree. The situation will dictate.
Yeah, there's certain backdrops that are impacted, but overall, in general, for the most part, as we already said, you can get away with a majority of the camo patterns and a majority of the environments. I will tell you, if you are exclusively hunting in snow, yes, invest in a snow pattern. The most out of place I have ever felt is both years that I went to Montana. Mind you, this is like end of September. Both years that I went to Montana, like the first day, both times, it snowed on us. And I'm up there in my Texas real tree patterns. Yeah. Walking around the snow feeling like an idiot because I'm like, they're going to see me from a mile away. Like, what am I doing here? Thankfully, the snow cleared and it got better, but it was like, the first year, it was like an anomaly. And then it happened again the second year. I was like, you got to be kidding me.
So at that point, you start looking for a big rock. You're like, I'm just going to lean against this. At least I'll kind of blend in.
Yeah, exactly.
But, yeah, I mean, it's going to be situational for sure, but I'm looking at these different camo patterns, and the ones that I would steer away from, but that's just because of how I hunt, are the ones with the big sticks in them, because I don't typically put myself in that kind of a backdrop.
Yeah. Well, even me, that like, I love sitting in a tree. It's my favorite spot.
Yeah, so you want the sticks.
Well, but even that, big sticks, my majority of my patterns don't have big sticks, but they work because they break me up.
Yes. So, yeah, and I'm looking at, I gravitate more towards, the color and, how much does it contrast with the other colors within that pattern.
Right.
That piece sitting right there, that's a pretty drastic contrast. You're not going to want to use that one. You're not going to want to use that one in like a dry, arid, light brown tan environment.
Yeah.
That's not where you're going to want to use that. Now, will that one work for...
back out here?
Yeah, it'll work great out there.
Yeah,
I know it'll work great out there. I've used it. Will it work in, mesquite and, like the prickly pear cactus and yuccas and stuff like that? Yeah, it'll work pretty well.
Yeah.
But again, that's one where, you tend to just wear the bottom and then you manipulate your top.
Yeah, exactly.
If it's later in the season, you get a lighter top. If it's earlier in the season and it's a little more lush, you can go with the darker top, a little more contrast. But that's one of the key things. It's all going to come down to the contrast in the pattern itself. So if there's a huge disparity in the contrast, and this is completely exclusive of being up in the air, but if there's a huge contrast and you're in a really drab environment, you're going to stick out like a sore thumb. Mm-hmm. So if you minimize the contrast in that drab environment, then it'll break you up a little bit yet, but you're not going to stick out like, okay, yeah, that's pretty obvious that there's something not normal there.
Right.
But it's like me sitting in between these two trees in a ghillie suit with a rifle. That deer knew that there was not supposed to be something in between those trees.
Right.
Now, were I to be laying down, he probably would have approached. But I was sitting in a tripod chair because I'm lazy. I don't like laying in bugs.
I know very few people that would have laid down in that situation. Well, Before we wrap up this topic, I want to acknowledge this has nothing to do with camo. I want to acknowledge the shirt that you're wearing. I love it. And you wore this in our last podcast. I didn't say anything, mainly because I just didn't want to feed the fire that we were already diving into. But if you guys are watching the video, we'll get him to fold down his computer screen so you can see. If you're not watching the video, Mike is wearing a light gray t-shirt with a rainbow on it, and in big goofy letters it says, "This is my killing shirt." And I love it.
There's an upgraded version of it. It has I think it was Care Bears on it or something, or it's got a unicorn or something on it. But yeah, it's funny. It's just seemed appropriate.
Yeah, I like it. It's I might have to get me one. I like it that much. Well, anyway, that has nothing to do with camo, but I wanted to highlight that because,
I mean, it'll blend in with brick buildings just fine.
Yeah, that's true. Match your environment, right?
There you go. So yeah, urban hunting. Like there's some states, like literally. I mean, I'm going to say that, and people tend to take that the wrong way. That's not what I mean. But there are certain situations where, like, I don't know if they still do it, but in Des Moines they used to do a pistol season and pistol and archery in city limits. So you're literally doing urban hunting.
Oh, like there's all the Seek. I don't know if you've seen the Seek One guys on YouTube, but they're bow hunters, and they pretty much exclusively hunt in like the suburbs of Atlanta and all these places. Like these people that just have these 1 or 2 acre properties, these McMansions built on them, but the back half is woods, and the deer come up and eat their flowers, and they hate it. And these guys go back there and hunt. But they're killing 200-inch whitetails back there. They're killing record book deer was the crazy part.
I mean, again, you have situational. So if you have like these old, like an abandoned grain elevator or something like that, well, obviously there's going to be a lot of activity around an old abandoned grain elevator.
Right.
Old abandoned grain elevators are made of concrete. Concrete's gray. So why would you wear
camo? You would wear your killing shirt instead.
Exactly. You just wear a nice, long sleeve underneath it, throw this on, and then, smile, wait for the flash.
There you go.
So, but yeah, it all depends. I mean, there's a lot of the, the city limits hunting, urban hunting, stuff like that. I mean, you're going to be attaching most of the time to a building. So why wouldn't you want to look like that building?
Yeah.
So, that's where your grays and your, they actually literally call it urban camo.
Yeah,
and
true.
It's the blacks and whites and all that, and it kind of blends out as you get further out from it. It just kind of melds into a flat gray-ish color. And the weird thing about, and this is kind of a human thing, I don't know if like animal eyes do this, but as far as humans go, the further we are away from something, I mean, you might notice a color variation at the beginning, but your brain will instinctively fill that in and make it the same color. It'll fill those gaps. If something's not there, it'll fill that gap, and you might not see it, but your brain will fill in that gap. So there's a continuity thing that happens. Yeah. And I'm not sure if it happens with animals or not. I mean, the assumption would be yes to an extent, maybe, because they still have the same wiring we do. Mm-hmm. But who knows? I haven't had that conversation with a doe yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, appreciate you knocking another one out with me, talking about a topic that was on my mind, like I said, since that experience we had. So I enjoy the conversation. Thanks, man.
Yeah, no problem. Appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. We're in your place. So for our listeners, thank you all for listening. As always, follow and subscribe whatever podcast platform you're listening on. We're on all the major apps: Waypoint TV, Carbon TV, YouTube, and our website. That website's the hub. That's where all of our content goes through, all of our various media series and videos that we do. So be sure you check that out. Subscribe to the YouTube, all the social platforms. Head on over to that website, pick you up a hat or a shirt, support a small-time hunting brand. And last but not least, Ridge Rock Hunt Company. We enjoy our partnership with Derek and Lacey over there. They book hunts with vetted outfitters across the country. So if you guys are looking to schedule a hunt, that once-in-a-lifetime experience, give Derek a call. He'll work with you on timeline, licensing, costs, location, all that good stuff, and get you set up somewhere where you're guaranteed to have a good time. So Ridge Rock Hunt Company, go check them out. Thanks again, Mike.
Yep, thank you.
All right, guys. We're back again next week, as always, with another episode, and I'll catch you then.